Hi there, I'm Erin with Quilting Rebel. So today's video is going to be about making binding for your quilt. Now, specifically the type of binding that I am going to make is width of fabric. So you have two choices really with binding. You can do bias, which some consider to be the preferred method, or width of fabric. And I have just always done it with the fabric. It's how I was taught. I've just stuck with it. I've washed some of my quilts many times and not had any issues with it whatsoever. So it's really the method that I prefer. So let's just get started and I'll show you how I make my binding, how we attach our binding at the end, because sometimes that can be a little tricky for people, even me. And I will it's just the basics of binding. So let's hop over to the cutting table and get started. Okay, the first thing we need to know is how many inches of binding do we need to go all the way around our quilt. So I have taken my quilt here and I have folded it in half and then half again. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure each side, multiply times 4, and see how many inches we need to go around our quilt. So I'm just going to measure this out, and I've got about 35 on this. So I'm going to take 35 times 4. And then I'm going to do this side, and I'm going to measure, and I'm going to call it about 20, it's a little short of 27, but I'm going to call it 27. And we're going to take that times 4, so we'll add those together. I'm going to add another 12 inches to that total because we need a little extra when we're putting our binding together, when it comes together at the end. And I came up with 260 inches of binding that I need for this quilt. So now we're going to go over to the cutting table and figure out how many strips we need. Okay, we're at the cutting table now, and I have my fabric all spread out. Now, I figured out that I needed 260 inches of strips, or 260 inches all the way around my quilt. And that's with an additional 12 inches added because we need a little extra to work with when we join our binding, when we meet on the quilt, and you'll see what I mean. So what I did is I figured out my width of fabric minus the selvage. So I needed to take off about 1 inch for the selvage, and when I measured this, it came out to 20.5 inches. That's times 2 because I've got 20.5 inches here, 20.5 inches here, right? So it's 41 inches of strip that I have here. So I take 260 divided by 41 and I get the figure 6.34. So I need basically 6.5 strips. So I'm going to cut 7 strips. So what we do is we lay out our fabric. I have ironed mine because you want to get a lot of the wrinkles out just to help get straight cuts. And I'm going to trim up this one edge to start with. We just want to trim that off so we make sure that we're starting with a fairly even edge. So now we'll come over here. And I like to cut mine at 2.5 inches, my binding. Some people do it at 3, some 2 1/4. I just find that 2.5 works pretty well. So we want to line this up here, and I'm lining it up all the way over here. Now the cool thing about this Omnigrip ruler that I have, it has a 1/2 inch mark over here, which kind of makes it easier. So I can flip that around and I can automatically now put that on 2.5. And it's a little bit easier just to line up. Okay, hold that down real good. Oh, brand new blade. Boy, does that feel good. Cuts like butter. And guys, if you don't have one of these Olfa rotary cutters, they are amazing. It has a lock so that it can't be opened. So you just unlock it and then you squeeze it, obviously, for the blade to show. And as soon as you let go, the blade goes back in. It's an awesome idea, especially when I'm working quick, because sometimes I tend to fumble around. I've got a little dog in here with me, so I've known to knock things off the table so I don't have to worry about anybody getting cut. So we'll just whip these out really quick. I need 7. Just line it up really good. It's really easy to get off. And I'm working with stripes here, and I'm not too concerned about it. I think the binding is going to be relatively small, so I don't think the stripes are going to be super critical. At least they're not going to be running up and down my quilt like that. That might be a little bit more difficult to work with. So let's see, what do we have? 4? So we'll do number 5 here. And this is width of fabric binding, because this is the width of the fabric. Here's number 6. And the final one, number 7. It looks like I'm doing good. My fabric's lining up really nice, so I'm doing well on my cutting. Okay, now we have number 7. Now what we're going to do is simply cut off our selvage. I just kind of put it up like this. I get it fairly close. So this does not have to be super accurate. I mean, you want it, you want it to be somewhat accurate, but this, if it's wobbly here, it's going to be hidden in your seam allowance because you're going to sew all these together. Let's just do these 4 really quick. Again, this does not have to be perfect. We're just cutting off our selvage. Throw that away. And I'll show you the rest of these. I just kind of try to straighten them out a little bit. Okay, let's cut off the selvage again. And now we have our 7 strips ready to go over to the sewing machine. And I'll show you here real quick. What we're going to do is unfold these, and you can iron the creases out now, or you can do it later. You'll need to iron it after you sew it as well, just to get your seams down. So how we're going to sew it at the sewing machine is on a diagonal. And I will show you why. You can do it this way, but what happens is when you sew it this way, see how this is a bulky seam? And you're going to be wrapping this around your quilt. And so you're going to be sewing through 6 layers right here, plus your quilt and batting and everything else. So when we do it on a diagonal, you're going to sew it from here to here. Then your seam is spread out more. It's hard for me to show here. I'll show it to you at the sewing machine. But we are going to join them like this, sew them at a diagonal. So let's head over there and I'll show you that. Okay, now we are ready to sew our strips together. So we're at the sewing machine. I have 2 ends here. So the first step is we are going to place these. So we're going to take one and we're going to lay it crossways over the other one. Grab a pen. I'm going to pin it up top first. We're going to be sewing right through here. So before I put my other pin in, I'm going to use my little 6-inch Omnigrid ruler. I love this thing. It's always right by my machine. And a disappearing ink fabric pen. So what we're going to do is we're going to line up one corner, line up the other corner, and we're just going to draw a quick little line. Now, this can shift some with just the pin in the corner there. So now that my ruler, this won't get in the way of my ruler, I'll put the other pin in just to hold it. Now, let's sew that line right there. Just using a stitch length of 2.5, just like you do in the quilting. Nothing different there. We'll just pop out our 2 pins. And now you can either use a rotary cutter, or I just simply like to use my fabric scissors on this. And we're just going to trim that to about 1/4 inch seam allowance. Just kind of eyeball it. Now, these seams you want to press open. I'm not a big seams open kind of gal. I'm usually to one side, the dark side, or one side or the other, right? But on binding, it's a lot more helpful. So remember earlier when I was telling you about how we don't sew them straight across like this, and the reason why, and I'll show you. So now, the next thing we'll be doing with our binding, we'll be folding it in half once we start working with it to wrap around our quilt. And this is why we don't do the up and down seams, because you can see this is diagonal. Well, and it's open, so see, now we've only got 2 layers we have to work with fabric. Whereas if this was on top of one another, it would either be 4 or 6, depending on how we had folded the seam allowance. So this just allows for spreading it out. If you do it the other way, you can kind of get bumps in your binding, and we don't want that. So definitely seams open, so on the diagonal. Okay, let's do the rest of the strips. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to want to iron our binding. Now, I haven't ironed all the creases out because we're going to iron this in half. So that's going to pretty much take care of all of our creases. So just put it face down and fold it just directly in half and iron the entire strips in half. So just keep going with this. Be careful when you get to your seams that you've got those open. We'll do our first one here in just a second. Show you what that looks like. So here's one. So I am just going to hit this with the iron because it's just finger pressed right now. So just iron that just a little bit. And now we're going to fold it in half. Ooh, it's hot. And just keep ironing. Okay. Do your entire length of binding that way. And at the end, what I kind of like to do is I kind of like to roll it up, or you can fold it however you want to do. All right, keep ironing. Okay, we're all ready to attach our binding to our quilt. That means our quilt is almost finished. So unroll a few feet off of your binding. And remember I said we needed that extra, 12 inches or so. So right here, we're just gonna kind of let that flop around. Sometimes I just pin it just so it's not getting in the way, but it should be fine. So I'm going to start down here kind of on a corner, close to a corner, because I want to show you how to do a corner right away. So Wonder Clips are wonderful for this. And if you want to pin it, you can also pin it. Oftentimes, once I get going, I really don't even pin it. I just kind of adjust it as I'm putting it under my needle. So it's whatever you are comfortable with. Probably best to start either pinning it or clipping it, right off the bat, just so you get used to it. So now as we get down here to the corner, we are going to take, and you can measure this or you can eyeball it, but we need to stop sewing 1/4 inch away from our end. And that's so we can make a nice mitered corner. So it's going to be right about there is where I need to stop. So I'm just going to pop a pin in there. I don't want to sew over that, but I'll remove it as I go. So head over to your table, go ahead, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam right along this raw edge. And we're going to stop right here, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to do this corner. I do like to use my walking foot for this just because there's a lot of layers. And I've got a mark right here on my walking foot that is the 1/4 inch. So I will be paying attention to that. And when you get started, you are going to backstitch. So just a few back stitches. And never mind my machine, it's acting up a little. Got some things to try. Oh, my pin fell out. Whoops. Whoops, sorry. Well, we'll be eyeballing that then, won't we? It's about right on this stripe right here. One more. And then back stitch. I hit cut. So let's just go back a little bit and seal the deal there. I hit the wrong button. That's how it goes with sewing, right? Now we can cut. And now I'll show you how to make this corner. Okay, so now we've got that sewed down to a 1/4 inch. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our binding, we're going to fold it up. And see, when we fold it up, we have some resistance there at that 1/4 inch. And what's going to happen is you should see a nice line here, right here. See how that kind of lines up? So you're going to just kind of finger press that and hold that down. Then you're going to fold it down. And you're going to make that crease even with the edge of your quilt. See how that works? So we have this little tab. Now what we're going to do is we are going to clip or pin that right there. And I probably like to put one up here to kind of hold that. And now we're going to get ready to just sew down this entire side right here. So what you're going to do is you're going to start right at the edge of this quilt, not a 1/4 inch in. You're going to start right at the edge. You'll want to back stitch and then go down the length of the quilt and then do the another corner all the way around. And this will create the mitered corner so that it folds around your quilt. And it works really, really well. It makes it really, really pretty. So let's head over to the machine and finish 1/4 inch in seam allowance. And we're starting right at the edge. And back stitching. I probably back stitch more than most people do. I don't know why. I can't do 1 or 2. It's always 4 or 5. So do whatever you feel is correct. Maybe I've stopped about a 1/4 inch shy. We can lay it out and we can see I hit that pretty good. See how it creates a straight line there? So we're going to kind of pull that. Fold it at a 45. Get this even. Clip it right up here and right quilt turned and get it in the machine. So again, we're going to start at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, but we're going to start right on the edge of the quilt. And I'm not going to hit cut this time. Might not be, my hand might be getting in the way. So we're going to back stitch. And this is where I tend to not clip or pin, and again, that is totally up to you. Just try to maintain that 1/4 of an inch. And sometimes if your binding seems like it's getting in the way or whatnot, sometimes I will throw it in a basket or a box or something on the floor to roll it out of. And sometimes that kind of helps, and it helps to, keep it from getting dirty, falling all over the floor. Okay, let's finish the rest of this binding up. So what happened there is I got a thread too far. So I just clipped the last little thread because I know I backstitched over the others. So I'm feeling pretty confident about that. Okay, you are almost done sewing it to the back, but now we have to join the binding. That is always a little bit of a confusing part for everybody, including me. Sometimes I need a refresher to remember how to do it. So we have these two ends, and clearly we have too much binding here, so we need to trim that to be just the right size. So what we're going to do is we're going to lay down this shorter piece that we started with. We're going to lay it down flat. And we're going to use this extra binding as a measurement tool. So what we're going to do is we are going to open it up because we need this width, this 2.5 inches. So if you cut yours at a different amount, I mean, you could go by that amount. I like to just actually use the fabric as the measurement. And we're going to lay it down on top of this one. So if you see, we're lining up this edge with the edge of the binding underneath. And what we're wanting is to get this measurement over here for this. So now let's lay this fabric, this binding out nice. Make sure it's even and flat. And now what we're going to do is we're going to cut right here on just that top layer of binding. So shift it just a smidgen. So let me get that kind of back right there. So I know I'm going to cut down that pink. This is where the lines come in handy. Stripes, I should say. So we're going to cut right there. And now we have this extra we can take out. And now we have where we can join these two. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the top one and you're going to open it up and lay it flat like this. I'm going to use my scissors to just kind of hold it down there for a second. We're going to take this one and open it up. Okay, we're going to open it up and we're going to move it over. Get my other binding out of the way. So, okay, it's laid flat. I'm going to open it up and move it over to this binding. And just like that. Does that make sense? Do you want to see that again? Let me show it to you again. So we have them cut. We've got a 2.5 inch overlap because that's how wide our binding was, 2.5 inches. So if you made it 2 3/4, this would need to be 2 3/4. So we're going to open this up like that and lay it flat. And we're going to open this one up this way. And then we're going to bring it over. So now what I like to do is I like to throw a really quick pin in here, not accurate at all, just to hold it, just so I know I've got my layers right. I like to get a Wonder Clip pin, or clip, and I like to kind of pinch this together here because it tends to fight these pins, you can kind of see. And that's why I kind of like to leave a little more even not sewed here, so you have a little more flexibility. So now let's get this a little bit more accurate. So I'm going to pin on the corners here. Oops, wrong way. I'm going to pin on this corner. And on this corner. And we are going to sew diagonally this way. So let's just make a mark. And head over and let's sew that really quick. I'm just going to turn you a little. You don't have to backstitch there, but sometimes I do. Okay, now before we trim this piece off, let's double check and make sure we're correct. So if you notice, if you just kind of fold it up in there, see how it folds up? Take our clip out and see how now we have that same diagonal, so that we did it right. If you cut it, if you sew it the other way, it won't work. So you have to make sure that you've got that right. So now what we can do is we can just simply take our scissors and trim this off. Just leave about 1/4 inch on the fabric. And I just kind of finger press this open. I don't go to the iron or anything. So just kind of finger press that open. And now you can simply just start where you left off, backstitch, and sew the rest of your binding on. Okay, let's get to it. Oops. and you can see how perfect our binding is now. We don't have any gaps, we don't have any extra. It's just exactly the right size. And it's all done. Now we're ready to flip. And let me show you how the corners work now. So now we're getting ready to flip this over and machine quilt it to the front, or you can hand quilt it. That is up to you. I'm a machine quilter, so that's what I'm going to show you. But here's how the corners work. So when we fold this around on the other side, we'll just simply overlap it. Show you on the front side of the quilt, I'm sorry. So we will just simply overlap it like that as we're sewing it down on the other side. And look how pretty those corners are going to be. Isn't that neat? I love the mitered corners. They make me feel like I've done a really good job. So now you'll want to clip to the front. The back is not as important, but now that we're going to work on the front side, what people are going to see, this is where you probably want to spend a little more time and clip it to kind of get it to hold around that batting, because we're going to hide our edges. I usually clip maybe a half of a row, and if you've got a spot where maybe it's a little off, you can just go in with your scissors and trim it just a little bit if you need to. It's okay. Once this quilt is washed, I don't have any more clips. Here we go. Once the quilt is washed, a lot of those little things that you think are a big deal won't even show. Now, obviously, if you're doing a quilt show quality one, you'll want to be super precise. I don't think I will ever make one of those because I am not a super precise quilter. Okay, so let's get started. I'll show you a little bit of how this works, but I think you mostly get the gist of that. Well, one thing I did change is I did go ahead and clip down this whole side because I realized I was going the wrong way for the way that I sew. And I got to this corner and I got to thinking too, if you have maybe missed the mark on this little corner a little bit, it's okay if you need to just snip off a little bit of that corner. This one's fine, but I'll just show you. I mean, you can just snip a little bit of that if you think it's too bulky, or you got a little extra batting in there or something, just snip it off. And ideally, you want this point and this seam to meet. So just kind of work with it a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here and go this way. I'll show you what that looks like. Also, just a tip, if you have tons of strings, like for some reason I seem to have a lot of strings, I just simply try to kind of tuck them in. I don't know, there's probably people out there that want you to trim them all. I don't know. I call it extra warmth on my quilt, right? It's just extra warmth. Here again, see where my diagonal seam is right here? I'm not sure if you can see that. Might be a little bright. But see, again, here we're going over that diagonal seam and it's spread out, whereas if it was a straight seam and it was on top of one another, see how much extra bulk you're getting into now? Now, how do we sew this? This, we want to sew as close to this edge as possible. I sew in just, I don't know, 3 thread lengths or widths, excuse me, 3 thread widths at least, something like that. So I have a mark on my needle right here. I'm sorry, I have a mark on my foot right here where my needle is. So I just try to kind of keep that just to the inside on the binding. And backstitch, I forgot to backstitch. This process you'll want to go a little bit slower. And be sure that your thread matches whatever you want it to do. Whatever, if you want it to be an accent, you can. But you do want to keep your stitch length at 2.5 because we need the binding to be tough and tight, well attached. As you get down here, a stiletto can really help you. If I knew where mine was, it would be great, but I don't. I'll probably just use my Bernina scissors, or my Tula scissors. I just pinch them shut and use them as a stiletto. This helps to just hold everything as you're getting into this corner. Now, how do we do the corner? So we're going to sew right. Let me adjust the camera just a little bit. You're going to sew right to the edge of that fold, okay? And you're going to stop with your needle down. You're going to twist and you're going to sew up that seam, okay? And then you're going to backstitch back down. Needle down's important. Now we're going to turn to make the next side. So I'll just start out, you don't need to backstitch. And we'll get this finished and I'll take it out and show you what that kind of looks like when it's all sewed down.